Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and what we're going to discuss in this section are flying lasers, poison bottles, ancient economics, jungle cities, and the history of archaeology. We're going to continue and complete our discussion of the past, of the study of the past, by rounding out the last bits of that outline right up above my little yellow box. We're going to move on to Act 3 of our 3-act play, Archaeology as a 21st century scientific methodology. Now, in the wake of the collapse of the new archaeology, in the wake of the collapse of processual archaeology, there emerged a different understandings of how to address questions about the human past. These tended to get bundled together into these small little schools. There was sort of the post-processualist humanistic approach. There was kind of a sort of lighter, more nuanced understanding of the past, something that some theoreticians called processualism light. But generally, there is the understanding in the 21st century that archaeology doesn't really need these big theoretical frameworks. Archaeology is simply a way to ask questions about the human past through the medium of the archaeological record. And we've gotten to the point where we can examine the archaeological record using toys and using technology that, Pitt Rivers could never have even dreamed of. These things include, cesium magnetometry, projecting magnetic fields into the ground, and how the magnetic field changes, can tell you what's in the ground without even digging up a single spadeful of dirt. There's our flying lasers in the upper left-hand corner. That's a LiDAR, where scanning lasers are attached to the bottom of aircraft, or drones in this case, and they fly over landscapes, mapping entire sites in a matter of minutes. And then there's some very high-tech stuff right over there. And this includes laser ablution inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, which can take these ceramic vessels, extract and laser ablate part of their surface, and give you the chemical composition of the ceramic material itself, of the ceramic paste, which gives you the recipe that the ancient potter used when they created it. And because potters generally use unique recipes, unique ceramic paste recipes, you can track the individual skill of a potter through time, thousands of years after they created the pot. It is a very, very interesting and very exciting time to ask questions about the human past, because archaeology in the 21st century is generally a high-tech, highly scientific methodology. It is primarily a methodology. It is used to answer questions about the past. Where these questions exactly come from is, frankly, it's irrelevant. Questions can come from history, they can come from art history, they can come from economics, they can come from political science, they can come from traditional anthropology. It really doesn't matter where the question comes from. What matters is, can you take this question? Can you craft a hypothesis? Can you craft multiple hypotheses? And can you test these hypotheses against the archaeological record? Archaeologists take to the field with a research question in mind. They excavate carefully, they excavate methodically, and then return to the laboratory. Indeed, archaeologists today generally spend 3 or 4 hours in the lab for every hour they spend in the field. Archaeologists spend a lot of time staring at computer screens, staring at statistical models, creating chi-squares, staring through microscopes, than they do staring at ancient ruins. And I am no exception. I have spent many, many hours hunched over tiny little glowing computer screens, trying to take, what I have there on the left, trying to take tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of little ceramic sherds, analyze them, crunch the numbers, and turn them into data that can answer questions about the human past. And yes, I would say easily I spend, 3 or 4 days in a laboratory for every day I spend in the field. Most archaeology today is spent doing that, is spent hunched over a computer screen, analyzing materials chemically, statistically, mathematically, geographically, even mapping these distributions, on a map or on a spreadsheet. That's generally what archaeologists do. Now, some of these questions they answer, some of them are really big questions like the ones we've discussed. What is the relationship between the state and what is the relationship between society? And we'll deal with a really big question in the next module. What is the relationship between these ancient people and their environment that they lived in for tens of thousands of years? But what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about a few fairly interesting but little slightly smaller questions about the human past. How a 21st century archaeology actually operates, how it actually answers questions about the past. So we're going to take little questions. We're going to take little bitty ones. And we're going to discuss the mystery of the classic Maya poison bottles. And it starts with these tiny little ceramic vessels here. Now, archaeologists recovered these tiny little bottles, for 100 years from funerary contexts, from middens, from building deposits. And these are little bottles. They're only about this big. In fact, they're not much larger than this little bottle I have right here. And in fact, we're going to meet this fellow again in just a tick. They're very small. And one of the questions is, what did they actually use these things for? They're far too small to drink out of. You couldn't have kept anything in them other than maybe a few ounces of material. And they generally were just called poison bottles because of their superficial resemblance to 19th century medicine bottles or poison bottles. So the great mystery of the classic Maya poison bottles is, what were these things actually used for? And some of them are quite elaborate. I mean, some of them have these carved figures. Some of them have, gods in meetings, and some of them have very simple geometric designs on the exterior. What were these little bottles actually used for? Some of these bottles have glyphs, and these glyphs give a hint of what they could be used for. And what these bottles say, what the glyphs on these Maya bottles say, is that they say they're being used as the home of tobacco. And in fact, if you look there on the lower left, that's a translation of one of the dedicatory texts on one of these tiny little poison bottles. It says, "It is the home of the tobacco powder of turtle macaw." And this was not restricted. There's been about half a dozen of these different glyphs that have been interpreted that hint that these tiny little poison bottles ultimately have something to do with tobacco. So here's the hypothesis, that these little bottles, these little poison bottles, were used to store tobacco. Now it only remains to find a way to test this hypothesis, to develop a methodology to answer this question. And here's the methodology we're going to use. If this little vessel above my little yellow box was used to store tobacco, that's tobacco on the upper left, then there should be residue from that storage. Tobacco, of course, contains the chemical alkaloid nicotine, and that's the neurological alkaloid that affects the human nervous system. There it is right there. So if this little vessel was used to hold tobacco, then we should be able to detect the residue of the chemical signature of tobacco, which is to say, we should be able to find nicotine. Now, this is what researchers went after. Specifically, this is what Jennifer Lohmiller Cardinal looked for when she applied her chemical residue analysis to these little poison bottles. And working with chemists, working with big fancy machines that go burr and have little lights that go back and forth, this is what she was able to discover. Jennifer Lohmiller Cardinal then applied that methodology to these ancient Maya poison flasks and was able to chemically demonstrate that these vessels were in fact used for the storage of tobacco. She detected the chemical signature of nicotine inside these vessels. So these little classic Maya poison bottles were not in fact poison bottles. They were tobacco flasks. They are snuff bottles. And that's why they look just like Chinese snuff bottles, just like the Chinese snuff bottle I'm holding right here. This isn't ceramic, this is ivory. At any rate, Jennifer and I then decided to explore this together. And what we rapidly determined was, this is not an isolated instance. There are dozens, if not hundreds of these, if not thousands of these little bottles. And indeed, we rapidly discovered that many of these bottles are in fact identical. Here we have 3 bottles. This is not 2 different photographs in one drawing of the same bottle. All 3 of these bottles are different. Yet if you look at these these pseudoglyphic designs on the exterior, they are all identical. These bottles are being produced through the use of stamped molds, which is to say that these bottles are being mass produced. These snuff bottles in ancient America are being produced in large numbers, probably to contain tobacco, which is itself being produced in large quantities. So you have these Maya cities, they're producing tobacco in large quantities, and they're mass producing snuff bottles to sell this tobacco in. And when we started discovering that there's multiple versions of these same bottles, then it unlocked the secret of these little snuff bottles. Large numbers of these bottles are being made. Tobacco is being raised, it's being grown, it's being exported and sold in large quantities. And we can detect this trade in tobacco, this ancient trade in tobacco, thousands of years ago, through the archaeological record of these tiny little snuff bottles. And again, here we have, identical snuff bottles that are being made probably at the ancient city of Copan in large quantities. They are mass producing tobacco, and they are mass producing snuff bottles to go with that tobacco. Now, we published this research in Breath and Smoke, where we discussed one of these bottles right up above me. This is Lady Cabell's snuff bottle, and the bottle itself was almost certainly manufactured at the city-state of Copan, yet it ended up in the funerary assemblage of this great queen of El Peru Waka, something like 500, 600 kilometers away. And all of this became unlocked with simply asking the question, how can we test for the presence of ancient tobacco? And this is basically how science is working. This is how archaeology is working in the 21st century, using high technology toys. There's my digital microscopy right up above me, where I'm using, a very simple digital microscope to scan in the paste profiles of thousands of sherds. And I'm taking those thousands of sherds you see there on the left, and I'm recording their paste profiles in order to determine cheaply how these vessels were created in antiquity. And in my laboratory down in Guatemala City, I use very, very intelligent, very bright students. And over the last 10 years, we've analyzed, over 136,000 sherds, 329 partial or whole vessels. And this includes vessels from over 104 burials, including the 7 major tombs from the city of El Peru Waka. And what we do with this is we crunch all of these numbers and we produce these amazing statistics that you can see there on the left, tracking how different styles are changing over time, tracking how different styles and how different ceramic types are distributed across the site as a whole. And what we can do is then interrogate the database, interrogate the statistics that we've recorded, and ask questions of our statistical database. Ask questions of the material that we've recorded from the archaeological record. And one of the things we ended up with was that right there, looking at something very simple like F statistics of scattered pottery. And basically, I'm not going to belabor the point, but basically the logic behind these ANOVA F statistics was to judge the degree of variance across the site. And the logic was that the lower the F statistic, the more uniform the assemblage, the lower the degree of variance. And therefore, if you follow these economic arguments, the more likely the type of ceramic was bought and sold at a market. It was distributed through market research. And as you can see, certain types of ceramics at different points in time look like they're being bought and sold in a marketplace. The Tinaja red vessels are almost certainly being bought and sold in a market. The Infierno black vessels, they are sold at a market at one point in time, but later in the city's history, they are not being bought and sold in the market. The polychromes, like that elaborate full figural vessel you see right up above me, it's in bad shape, but it used to be quite nice. These things are probably rarely sold in marketplaces. They're probably commissioned vessels for prestige gifting, except for a very small sliver of time in which it seems that the Maya potters of this ancient city were dumping large amounts of polychromes on the open market, probably because things were very dangerous at the time. And what we're doing is modeling the ancient economic activity in this city through the study, through the statistical analysis of the site's pottery. So we take those 10,000 sherds, we take those 136,000 sherds, and we run them through these statistical models. And we're looking at how different types of ceramics are being bought and sold, or being gifted, or being made and consumed. Different types of economic exchange that you can see there on the upper left. Commerce, redistribution, autarky, barter. How different types of exchange, how different types of distribution are going to leave different economic impacts on the economics of the city, on the archaeological record of the city. And the funny thing is, and what makes this so difficult, is that different types of exchange can all be occurring simultaneously. And what we're trying to do is to rebuild the ancient economy, or reconstruct how the ancient economy of the entire city operated, using the ceramic data as a proxy measure of economic activity. And as you can see right up above, some of these are working. Some of the ceramics are being bought and sold. Some of the ceramics are being gifted through redistribution. Some of the ceramics are being produced and consumed in self-contained units. That's what autarky means. And some ceramics are being bartered. They're being exchanged in social exchange with neighboring social units. This is how we are taking all of these 106,000 sherds. We're measuring them and running them through these statistical models, and we're reconstructing the ancient economy of this pre-Columbian city and how it functioned through time. And what we're finding is that these classic Maya cities were much more economically complicated than we think of. We tend to think of, Native American societies as somewhat simplistic, lacking these sophisticated economic structures. But in reality, the archaeological record is in fact correcting us. The archaeological record is saying, no, these cities are every bit as economically complicated as probably large parts of the old world. And this again is bringing us, we're going from this little question to this very, very large question. There seems to be something universal about economic structures. These Maya cities, completely independently of anything from Europe or Asia or Africa, these Native American societies independently invented cities. They independently invented these different economic systems. They independently invented currency. They independently invented marketplace exchange. They independently invented commodification. And this is one of the real this brings us from a little question to a really huge question. Is there something, universal about commercialization? If different societies that are completely different and view the world in completely different ways, yet are building the same types of institutions over and over again in widely separated parts of the world. It brings us to understanding something about the human condition and understanding some commonalities of our past shared human history. Now, we're going to move on to the next section. We're going to talk about the environment. We're going to talk about cannibals of the Texas coast. We're going to answer questions about the ancient past, and I will see you there.